Kyle Wanju to tribal fires coming out of the Dumbartung Aboriginal Corporation in Perth, Western Australia. This story of tribal fires is titled Kyana Treasures. It's an episode on our gallery and the evolution of the gallery and how the artefacts all merged over a lifetime of work to be exhibited and displayed as part of the cultural foundation of Dumbartung. It's a gallery that we're very proud of, that we've been able to, without any government assistance, just through self-generated income and other means, that we've been able to curate and exhibit to the public. It's a very important part of Dumbartung's cultural capabilities portfolio. It's a collection that was awarded a significant assessment in 2010 by the Prime Minister and Cabinet and the National Library and Archives, which meant that the gallery was extremely important historically to Australia and its peoples. And we received the award at a gala event in Canberra. Myself and Selena travelled over to Canberra, and we were part of a number of agencies and organisations that were awarded this significant assessment. However, the assessment itself, and in terms of its significance, is the first time that an Aboriginal organisation has received that award for a cultural collective. And again, being a grassroots organisation and having to fight against the odds and having no resources from government, this is what we've been able to achieve in terms of this gallery.
This is an excerpt from the Dumbartung Aboriginal Corporation Significant Assessment, November 2011, by Dr. Brian Shepherd and Paul Bridges, museum consultants. The rich collection, gathered through the dedicated work of Robert Eggington, members of Dumbartung, and donated by many individuals, has been assembled to support these ongoing activities. The Kyana Gallery has become a tangible centrepiece of the campus from which Dumbartung reaches out into the wider community. Increasingly, it is being understood that museums and collections that contribute to a social good are those most likely to survive in the future. Having such a strong sense of social purpose, and with a demonstrated history of having made a difference in many people's lives, Dumbartung amply meets this criteria.
To understand the gallery, I think, is to have an insight into a number of initiatives that Dumbartung coordinated over its 35 years. And I think the most important access to this artwork and collective came from the Kyana gatherings, which were held on the foreshore of the Derby Yerrigan in Perth. And that particular gathering was made up primarily of performing artists as well as visual artists. So, we were given a lot of gifts of artworks from the visiting groups that performed at Kyana, such as the Bardi dance group. We received a number of, over the years, artefacts and carved shells from the Bardi mob. And also one really important piece of art that is in the Kyana Gallery, which is the honey ant dreaming, that was gifted to Dumbartung from the Nananjara women in the Western Desert Block. We also were privy to purchasing a lot of the art that we exhibited through the Aboriginal Prisoners Art Program, and Dumbartung ran that through most of the 1990s, and we ran 5 exhibitions of artworks from prisons, and we acquired a number of artworks which were profound artworks from extremely well-known artists that make up a major part of the collective. One of the most profound initiatives in which Dumbartung utilised to acquire probably most of the artefacts, but also a good amount of the important artworks historically from the southwest, that being primarily the artwork of Revel Cooper, Reynold Hart, Bella Kelly, Gary Woods and others. We were able to acquire the artworks and the artefacts through these major processes. Two of the major initiatives in which we utilised in order to access and acquire the works and the artefacts was from antique shops around Perth, and I would have walked every weekend for many years from Midland antiquity shops through to Fremantle, all through Perth, and I would look into each one of those outlets. And in those years, and we're talking 20 years ago now, we acquired many pre-colonial objects, and we acquired some very important Kylies or boomerangs from the Pilbara areas, the Kimberley and the Southwest. They're very rare and very important in our collection. Another access in which we used was one of my daughters informed me of the eBay auctions, which were electronic auctions. And eBay in those days, and I'm talking the early 90s now, was flooded with really old objects and artefacts, and some of those were sacred boards which we were able to acquire and put into keeping rooms here at Dumbartung and into our vault. However, we were able to also acquire many pre-colonial objects of our old people's ways. So that was important, as was the other auctions, which again, mainly auctions that were under the hammer at places like Claremont here and also East Perth. Over the years, we acquired an incredible amount of paintings and artworks from auction houses, both electronic and, as we said, under the hammer auctions. And over the years, there's been an incredible amount of the objects and materials that people have donated to Dumbartung. And we've been fortunate because, of course, working in the area of the arts and art development and promotion for Aboriginal artists, of course, we were gifted a lot of the work from particular artists, and that makes up and probably constitutes for 30% of the entire collection. And they're important because they're gifts of appreciation, gifts of love, and gifts that have somehow identified the connection between Dumbartung and the artists to whom have created the works. So the Kyana collection is a massive collection of objects, particularly the artefacts, and a lot of the collection that we have is made up primarily of boomerangs. In our language in the Southwest, we call boomerangs Kylies. And I think the boomerangs are an incredible part of the collection because they're from right across Australia, and we have got different boomerangs that are used for different purposes. Some of the boomerangs for hunting, some of the boomerangs for ceremonial use, and some of the boomerangs for fighting. It's a massive collection of boomerangs. I've often stated to many people that it's no doubt probably Australia's greatest and most massive boomerang collection. Another part of the artefacts that make up a huge part of our collection are the mirrors, or commonly known as the woomera, which is the apparatus where a spear will go into the woomera, and the woomera gives the spear more accuracy and more speed. Mirrors that we have here at Dumbartung have got stories carved into the faces of some of the mirrors. They're a ceremonial type of object. And then we've got an incredible and a massive collection of digging sticks. Nullas, that's another name for them, and they're used for digging out the land and getting through to small animal burrows and other sources of food from the ground. And they're also used for fighting, and some of the fighting sticks, the nullas, are really huge and massive, made of very hard and strong woods. And then we've got a collection of coolamans, which are dishes that are carved and are used by Aboriginal women in particular in the Western Desert Block, where such things as fruits and berries and food sources would be put into the coolaman and carried back to the camp when the women were collecting the food sources. And also for carrying young babies, newborn babies. And the collection consists of a very, very broad collection of spears. And the spears have been collected from right around Australia over that 35-year period. And we've got hunting spears. We've got spears that are used for one might call tribal warfare, or for fighting. And there's another really important collection of spears in the overall collection is the punishment spears. And of course, the punishment spears were used for inserting into the body by tribal lawmen for when somebody, breaks the law. The wound that the punishment spear inflicts on the person is healed by the women within the group. And those spears are really important because they give us the opportunity to talk to our young people about the social structures of our communities and our culture, and how if those laws were broken, there was this extreme form of punishment. And of course, knowing that punishment and the laws, a lot of our people adhered to the law because the punishment was much more severe than an incarcerated form of punishment. So Aboriginal people had our own way of dealing with laws that were broken within our culture, and the ones that would exert the bigger punishment from the spears were those to whom had defied the skin group and married in and or run from the tribes with women that they shouldn't have been with, and vice versa. I think a really important collection within the Kyana Gallery is the kangaroo skins, in our language called the bukas. Selena, as part of the Kurimara Quad Women's Healing Program, with the women she was working with, made these bukas here at Dumbartung, and they're made in the same way in which our women from pre-colonial times had made the bukas in the bush. We had used emu oils, we used crushed wattle bark and ochres in order to tan the skins. And this process took a long time, and it was very enduring in terms of the mentality and the psychology that goes into making these bukas. And then, of course, each kangaroo skin that was tanned then gets sewn together with sinew, and then they're left to incubate in a lot of ways in terms of the materials, and then they become subtle and soft. And of course, the bukas were worn throughout the cold months in the southwest here, and that gave protections to the elements of the winter rains and the cold. But they were also used as burial robes. And that's why not many of these bukas survived after colonisation. There were a number that were taken overseas into institutions like the Edinburgh Museum and the Museum of Mankind in Canada, and throughout the Smithsonian Institutes in America. So we have noted that a number of the bukas are, been, in those collectives, and a number of them also in the Australian museums, but not many, because of the fact that when our older people were, being buried, they were buried in the bukas, so it was like a burial robe. These bukas stand so profoundly spiritual, and they have got such a presence that, the way in which we present them on tree limbs, and they're like guardians of the gallery. We were also very fortunate some time ago. We had a visit from two farmers from the southwest. They owned huge properties, and over the years they'd come across a number of old, ancient Noongar grinding stones. And, we were honoured to be able to access those grinding stones, and they were from Mukinbudin, Narrogin areas around that part of the southwest. And the grinding stones were stones that, Aboriginal women had used to grind up seeds that made, bush breads, and also pounded on different seeds to make forms of bush flour recipes, if you like. So, the grinding stones were very much an intricate part of Aboriginal culture and our way, in particular in the preparation of foods, and also grinding down sharp points, if you like, to certain, objects. We've also got a big collection of sacred objects that are kept within the vaults and kept out of public view, where non-initiated people nor women can see these particular objects. They're the real heartbeat of the collection. And the collection makes up a huge representation of our culture and art from right across this country. These objects were part of our endurance as Aboriginal people living off the land, again, in the pre-colonial times. And I think that what's important for our young people is to, again, maybe regenerate that knowledge of how to make these objects. And through that customary practice, we then become stronger in our identity, stronger in our sense of belonging, and understand our history as Aboriginal people and use these objects as the same as our old people used them. And I think there lays the future transition of re-strengthening our identity, our sense of belonging as Aboriginal people by utilising this knowledge in terms of our identity and particularly our young people. The initial impact that the gallery has on people is the beauty of the art. And I think the art is really important in understanding, again, that the art comes from right across Australia. The art comes from different areas such as the Kimberley, the Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, down through the Western Desert Block in through to Central Australia, and of course the southwest areas. So the artwork is also representative of the history, of the evolution of Aboriginal people. And art represents not only our culture and our stories, but it represents the ever-changing process of survival of Aboriginal people under colonialism and, of course, incarceration. And a lot of the artwork that Dumbartung has in the collection is from the prisons. We ran a major prison art exhibition and program during the 1990s, and a lot of the artwork represents the struggles of being incarcerated into a system. Some of the most historically important artworks that we have in the collection have been done by artists from the southwest. And those artists originally started their art concepts and their careers in a lot of ways in the old Karulup mission and other missions from right around the southwest. And one of the missions that obviously is profound and noted for the artwork that emerged from there was the Karulup mission. And that work was done by, incredible artists that were incarcerated for most of their life. They were part of the stolen generations. And the profound artist that we call the grandfather of the Karulup art movement was an artist called Revel Cooper. And Revel Cooper work now has become internationally acclaimed. His work is studied in universities, art degree courses right throughout Australia, in particular here in the southwest in universities such as Curtin in particular, Murdoch, UWA. All of the universities have an emphasis on these artists as part of their fine arts degree course. Some of his works that are in our collection are probably some of his most finest works. And one in particular, in which he titled The Crobbery Ground, was repatriated from an old shed in the southwest area at Boyett Brook. And when I brought it back to Dumbartung, I got one of the anthropologists from the Burnt Museum, John Stanton, to have a look at this particular part of the repatriation of a number of artworks that day. So when he saw Crobbery Ground, he said to me, Rob, he said, this particular artwork, he said, I would put within the top 3 of the most historically significant artworks ever to merge out of the southwest. Revel Cooper amongst our people was known to be a great storyteller and in many ways a street philosopher. He would go around in different parts of the fringes of Perth of a Friday and Saturday night, and I remember my aunties and others telling me that a lot of people would be finding out where Revel Cooper would be of a weekend night, and of course people would merge towards where he was and he would tell stories. He was also an extremely humorous man, so he had all of these talents of not just artwork but being able to tell these inspiring stories, and that was done also with some humour. Revel Cooper was a profound artist and he travelled a lot when he was outside of the prison systems, and I remember he travelled and a lot of stories come out of his time when he was in Redfern in New South Wales. He also moved into Victoria and was living in Victoria for a long time, and sadly his life was taken in Victoria by 2 Italian brothers in the Dandenongs, and his body was found and he was buried as a pauper in Victoria. Another artist in which features predominantly in the collection is Malcolm Ellis. Malcolm Ellis was an incredible landscape artist, and one of his works in which he painted was also used in our book that we wrote here at Dumbartung called Hamburgers for Masterpieces. And that title is self-evident in the book that, looks at the ways in which Aboriginal art in the southwest was exploited. And Malcolm Ellis was, an incredible artist. Again, his works were predominantly done whilst he was inside prisons and, other institutions like hospitals, etc. But he would also paint in the parks in and around Perth and in rehab centres. And I got to know Malcolm Ellis quite well. Malcolm Ellis was one of the first artists that really inspired in me this will, if you like, to not only appreciate our art, but to become involved with promoting it and curating it and collecting it whilst I've been here at Dumbartung. Again, he was a fringe dweller. He had very little other than just, the shoes he had on his feet. And yet he was one of the greatest artists I've ever come across, to whom really didn't really capitalise on the worth of his art because of the system and how he lived his life in society. But his work, again, will be remembered through our community as profound as will the work of Revel Cooper and others. Reynold Hart was another profound artist to whom a lot of his work is in the Kyana collection. Reynold Hart was one of the Carol-up artists. He was, in the eyes of many people, as profound as Revel Cooper. Reynold Hart was predominantly a landscape artist, and his works were also with Revel Cooper's and some of the other Carol-up child artists shown around the world. And Reynold Hart also only had a short life, as the other artists did have. And Reynold Hart, I think, his work has really been inspirational to a lot of contemporary modern Noongar artists, such as Swaggy Taylor, Lance Chadd, Tugga Morrison. All the great contemporary artists have been inspired by this one particular artist, Reynold Hart. And the Kyana collective of Reynold Harts is just profound and is a very important part of our collective. Other artists to whom make up the collection with their artworks are artists that again have been prolifically impoverished in terms of their life, and a lot of these were fringe dwellers, and again their remuneration for their art capability and their artistry hasn't really been indicative of how they live their life. When you look at the artworks of Revel Cooper and Reynold Hart, they will take you from traditional times, and within the painting they're pre-colonial times, and you've got Aboriginal people doing crobbery in the artworks, you've got them hunting, you've got Aboriginal, like families existing, and again I think the stories keep our people connected. With this art and these artists, it is a historical process in which our young people can learn about the decades which were really important for Aboriginal people and our history that isn't told within the mainstream curriculums, and very little of this history is even told by oral history from our families to our young people. A lot of the artists in which Dumbartung has been, I suppose, prioritised to collect have been artists that have been, subject to, appalling conditions in terms of their life, and policies of government in what and how their lives have been maintained in reference to institutionalisation. And a lot of these artists and the greater works of their abilities were created within the prison systems and within other institutions. So, these artists come from a very impoverished background. Most of the artists in which we have the works of were also part of the stolen generation. So these artists were taken away from their mothers and their fathers, and they were put into missions. And that there, I think, inspired and created this form of Southwest art. A lot of people refer to it as an incarcerated form of culture, an incarcerated form of art expression. And I think it was important because the art is used inside the prisons by these great artists as a process of healing. Before it even was a issue of where people utilised art as a healing agent and utilised the artistic expression in terms of healing. These artists were already doing that decades and decades before it became a therapy-based process. And I think, again, part of that healing was where they taught younger inmates, and they passed on the techniques of art and the exploration of colours and the ways in which a lot of this art seemed to melt the steel bars and crush the sandstone blocks of the prisons. And they found a type of freedom in terms of their lives to where they could paint the outside in. And of course, part of that healing was to keep that linkage to land through the landscapes, to keep that linkage with the stories through the art. And having that art taught to the younger prisoners, that was an extreme process of healing. And I think it was a process which, again, was also exploited by the authorities of those institutions. And I think the legacy of the artists to whom we've spoken about will create into the future this ongoing incredible phenomena of Noongar art coming out of the southwest of Western Australia. The aspiration and the hope of Dumbartung is to have the collection in the future put into a facility in which can exhibit it to the public with the dignity and the integrity in which this collection deserves. And I think it's important because the collection is the basis for the promotion, if you like, and or the ensuring of reconciliation between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people through the understanding of our culture and the artworks. And it's also extremely important for our younger generation and for generations to come. The collection is important now in the here, and it's important our young people access the collection, able to put their hands on the objects and learn from the objects in terms of the history of the artefacts and the artworks, and that that is then transmitted in through generations to come. So when you look at the importance of the gallery as it evolved over the last 35 years to this very point in time, what we have to do is look at the future and how this collective will sustain that knowledge and sustain that interpretation of history through the lens of the Aboriginal people, the vanquished, and not the lens of the victor. So I think what's really important here is that, you know, the collective be determined in its worth into the future. And that's where I think the bureaucracies of government and agencies like Lottery West and others who fund these sorts of concepts of galleries and, you know, keeping places take the priority, and they look at the funds needed in order to ensure that this collection is up and mounted and is done in a dignified way of integrity in terms of our culture and our spirituality.